Commander Jake Morrison stood in the center of the massive chamber aboard Harmony Prime. The space station floated in neutral territory between the major powers of the galaxy. Around him stretched walls of crystalline material that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The chamber was so large that Jake could barely see the far walls through the strange atmosphere that kept all the different alien species breathing comfortably. The Galactic Council had been meeting for 3 days now. Jake watched as beings he could barely understand moved in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. The Xerians looked like living crystals that sang in harmonies no human ear could properly hear. The hive delegates moved as one giant insect with 1,000 parts. Energy beings from the void realms flickered in and out of visible light like ghosts made of stars. Dr. Lisa Chang sat at the human delegation table. Her hands were folded, but Jake could see them shaking slightly. She had been arguing humanity's case for 72 hours straight. Behind her sat Captain Ryan Torres and the rest of Earth's diplomatic team. They all looked tired and worried. Jake knew they had good reason to be. High Arbiter Veltar rose from what might have been a throne, or might have been a living creature. It was hard to tell with beings made of pure thought. The Arbiter's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in the common tongue, but the words felt wrong in Jake's mind. Like trying to understand music by reading the notes on paper. The charges against humanity were read aloud. 3 border conflicts with mining cartels in the last year, 2 diplomatic incidents involving human colonies that refused to follow galactic law, violence against Council peacekeepers, refusal to submit weapons technology for inspection. The list went on and on. Jake remembered each incident differently than how it was being described. The mining cartels had been stealing from human worlds. The diplomatic incidents had been about protecting human children from alien slavers. But none of that seemed to matter now. Dr. Chang stood up one final time. She spoke about humanity's potential for growth. She reminded the Council of the good things humans had done since joining galactic society, the hospitals they had built, the rescue missions they had run, the scientific discoveries they had shared freely. Her voice was strong, but Jake could hear the desperation underneath. She knew they were losing. The translation system struggled with her words. Jake watched alien faces that showed no expression he could understand. Some species had no faces at all. Others had too many. He wondered what human emotions looked like to them. Did they see fear as weakness? Did they see anger as proof of guilt? Did they see hope as stupidity? High Arbiter Veltar spoke again. This time there was no mistaking the meaning. The Council had reached its decision. Humanity was too dangerous to remain part of galactic civilization. They were too unpredictable, too violent, too likely to disrupt the peace that had lasted for thousands of years. The sentence was complete isolation. All human ships were banned from galactic trade routes. All human colonies were forbidden from entering systems controlled by Council member species. The quantum communication networks that connected civilized worlds would be shut off to human space. Earth and her children would be alone in the dark. Jake felt something, cold settle in his stomach as he watched energy. Barriers spring up around the human ships, docked at Harmony Prime. Automated systems took control of their engines. Security drones moved into position around the diplomatic quarters. They were prisoners now, guests who had overstayed their welcome. Captain Torres leaned over to whisper in Jake's ear. The Council was already discussing the placement of sentinel stations around human space. Automated weapons platforms that would make sure humanity stayed in their cage. Any human ship that tried to cross the quarantine line would be stopped. By force if necessary. Dr. Chang was still trying to speak, but her translator had been shut off. Her words reached no alien ears. Jake watched her lips move silently as she pleaded for mercy that would not come. Security drones began to close in on the human delegation. It was time to go. The journey back to the human ships felt like a funeral march. Other species watched them pass with expressions Jake could not read. Some might have been pity. Others might have been relief. A few looked like they might have been fear. Jake wondered what they were afraid of. Humans were about to be locked away from the galaxy forever. Once aboard his ship, the UES Liberty, Jake called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. The news was worse than they had feared. Not only were humans banned from galactic space, but all trade agreements were void immediately. The alien technologies that human colonies depended on would no longer be maintained or replaced. Medical equipment would fail, terraforming systems would shut down, power grids would collapse. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim brought up the supply situation. Human colonies in the Outer Rim depended on regular shipments of equipment and materials from the core worlds. Many colonies could not produce enough food or maintain life support without outside help. If the quarantine held, they would start dying within months. The worst part was that Jake understood why the Council had made this choice. Humans were different from the other species. They fought when others would negotiate. They took risks when others would wait. They refused to bow down when others would submit. These traits had helped humanity spread across dozens of worlds in just a few centuries, but now those same traits were seen as threats to galactic peace. Dr. Chang joined the meeting looking older than she had that morning. She had spent the last hour trying to contact anyone in the Council who might help. Every door was closed. Every friend had become distant. Humanity had no allies left in galactic government. They were truly alone. Jake looked out at the stars through the bridge windows. Somewhere out there were 37 human colonies, 300 million people who had no idea their fate had just been decided by beings they had never met. Children playing in alien gardens that would soon wither and die. Families building homes on worlds that might become graveyards. The Liberty received clearance to depart Harmony Prime along with the rest of the human delegation. They would be escorted to the edge of Council space and then released to carry the bad news home. Jake ordered the engine started and felt the familiar vibration of the ship coming to life. In a few hours, they would cross the quarantine line. After that, there would be no going back. As the station fell away behind them, Jake made a promise to himself. Humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and the death of their own sun. They had spread across the galaxy against impossible odds. They would survive this too. The Council thought they were caging a dangerous animal. Jake wondered if they really understood what they had just awakened. 6 months had passed since the Galactic Council's judgment. Director Sam Rodriguez stood in the control center of the Kepler 442b mining operation and watched his world slowly die. The main excavation machines had been running on backup power for 3 weeks. The atmospheric processors that kept the air breathable were showing warning lights across every status board. Replacement parts that should have arrived months ago would never come. The mining colony had been one of humanity's most successful operations. Rich deposits of rare metals had made it a cornerstone of human expansion into this sector. Now the tunnels were flooding because the pumps were failing. The orbital refinery had shut down completely when its alien quantum processors burned out. 12,000 workers and their families were trapped on a world that was becoming more hostile every day. Rodriguez received the daily reports from his department heads with growing dread. Chief Engineer Mike Davis reported that they had maybe 2 months of power left, before the fusion reactors needed maintenance they could not perform. Medical Officer Dr. Jane White warned that the hospital's advanced treatment systems were already failing. People were starting to die from injuries and diseases that should have been easily treatable. In the Centauri system, Administrator Kate Williams faced a different kind of disaster. The agricultural worlds that fed half of human space were failing as alien biotechnology broke down. The soil enhancement systems that had made desert worlds bloom were going dormant. Crop yields had dropped by 60% in the last quarter. Williams walked through fields that had once been green and growing but now looked like the barren wastes they had been before human. Terraforming, the alien microorganisms that had been introduced to create fertile soil were dying without the special nutrients that came from Council-controlled worlds. Williams had tried everything her science teams could think of. Earth-based bacteria could not survive in the alien soil chemistry. Native organisms were too simple to create the complex ecosystem needed for large-scale farming. 3 worlds that had fed millions would soon feed no one. On Mars, Governor Ben Parker watched the terraforming project that had been the pride of human engineering slowly grind to a halt. The massive atmospheric processors that had been turning the red planet into a garden world were shutting down one by one. The alien technology that controlled weather patterns was becoming unreliable. Storms that should have brought rain instead brought toxic dust clouds that killed everything they touched. Parker stood in his office, overlooking New Shanghai, and remembered when the city had been built inside protective domes. Now people walked freely under open skies and breathed air that smelled of growing things. But the oxygen levels were already starting to drop. The great forests that had been planted across the southern continent were turning brown. In another year, Mars would be red again. Back on Earth, President Nicole Davis addressed a world gripped by fear and anger. The global economy had collapsed when galactic trade stopped. Unemployment was at levels not seen since the Great Wars of the 20th century. The alien technologies that had powered human civilization for generations were failing, and there were no replacements. Transportation networks ground to a halt. Communication systems went dark. Cities that had relied on alien power sources faced rolling blackouts. Davis tried to project confidence as she spoke to the billions watching around the world. She promised that humanity would survive this crisis. She announced emergency research programs and resource rationing plans. But privately, she wondered if those promises were lies. Earth itself might survive, but the colonial empire that humanity had built among the stars was crumbling. Millions of people were trapped on worlds that were becoming uninhabitable. In the underground laboratories of DARPA, Dr. Alex Chen worked 18-hour days trying to find alternatives to alien technology. The best minds on Earth had been assembled to solve problems that had never seemed urgent before. How do you build atmospheric processors without Xerion crystals? How do you create soil bacteria without hive biological templates? How do you generate power without council fusion technology? Every breakthrough seemed tiny compared to what had been lost. Chen's team had managed to create a primitive atmospheric processor that could work on Mars, but it would take 50 years to restore what alien technology had built in 5. They had developed new medical scanners to replace the quantum systems, but they could only diagnose problems they could no longer cure. Progress was being made, but not fast enough to save the colonies that were dying now. Commander Jake Morrison now held the rank of admiral and commanded what remained of humanity's deep space fleet. His ships patrolled the edges of human territory like guards watching the walls of a prison. The Council's Sentinel drones hung in space just beyond the quarantine line, sleek automated vessels that tracked every human ship and made sure none tried to leave. Morrison had watched 3 separate attempts to break through the blockade. Each time the Sentinel drones had responded with overwhelming force. They did not destroy human ships, but they disabled them completely. Electromagnetic pulses that burned out every system. Tractor beams that dragged ships back inside the quarantine zone. Boarding pods filled with maintenance robots that stripped away weapons and engines. The worst incident had been the colony ship New Hope, trying to reach a neutral trading post. Captain Tony Russo had been desperate to get medical supplies for his passengers. Hundreds of sick children who needed treatment that only alien medicine could provide. The Sentinels had stopped his ship 3 hours from the border. Morrison's rescue fleet had found the New Hope drifting powerless with life support failing. 60 children had died before they could be evacuated. Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UES Defiance, and stared out at the stars. Somewhere beyond the quarantine line was a galaxy full of wonders that humanity would never see again. Medical technology that could cure any disease. Energy sources that could power worlds for centuries. Knowledge and art and beauty from 1,000 different species. All of it forbidden now. The reports from the colonies grew worse every week. Food riots on New Geneva. Equipment failures causing mining accidents on Titan Station. Mass evacuations from worlds where life support was failing. Morrison had enough ships to help some colonies, but not all of them. Every day he had to choose which human settlements lived and which ones were abandoned to their fate. Lieutenant Sarah Kim brought him the latest intelligence report on Council activities beyond the blockade. Long-range sensors had detected massive fleet movements in several sectors. New Sentinel stations were being constructed. The automated systems that enforced humanity's isolation were being expanded and improved. It seemed the Council was preparing for something bigger than just maintaining a quarantine. Dr. Lisa Chang arrived on the Defiance carrying diplomatic pouches from Earth. She had been trying for months to find someone in the galactic community who would listen to reason. Every attempt had failed. Former allies refused to answer human communications. Neutral species were forbidden from trading with quarantined races. Even criminal organizations avoided human space for fear of Council retaliation. Chung reported that she had detected something disturbing in the few Council communications that human intelligence could intercept. References to a final solution. Discussions about permanent measures. Technical specifications for weapons that could sterilize entire worlds. The Council was no longer content to simply isolate humanity. They were planning something much worse. Morrison felt a cold anger growing in his chest as he listened to Chang's report. Humanity had been judged and sentenced by beings they had tried to join as equals. Now those same beings were planning to exterminate them completely. The quarantine had been just the first step. Soon would come the killing blow that would end human civilization forever. Unless something changed, humanity had perhaps months left to live. Dr. Sarah Mitchell knelt in the red dust of Tannhauser Gate and brushed sand away from something that should not exist. The dead world had been catalogued years ago as another failed colony from some forgotten species. Nothing but ruins and radiation under a dying orange sun, but the deep scan surveys had missed something buried far beneath the ancient city. Something that had been waiting for 50,000 years. The vault entrance was made of metal that registered on no known periodic table. It absorbed scanner beams and reflected energy in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The symbols carved around the doorway were familiar in a way that made Mitchell's skin crawl. She had seen similar markings in Earth's oldest caves. Drawings left by humans who had never invented writing but somehow knew how to depict star patterns they should never have seen. Mitchell's archaeological team had been working for 3 months to clear the excavation site. Graduate student Tim Roberts had found the first hints while studying mineral samples, traces of artificial materials buried deeper than any natural process could explain. Professor Carlos Mendez had insisted they investigate despite the danger. Tannhauser Gate was still irradiated from whatever disaster had killed its builders. Every day on the surface increased their cancer risk. When Mitchell placed her gloved hand on the vault door, the symbols began to glow. Not with electricity or heat, but with something that registered only on biological sensors. The door was reading her DNA, comparing her genetic pattern against a template stored in its memory banks. After a moment that felt like hours, the massive portal began to open. Ancient mechanisms moved without sound. Air that had been sealed away since before human civilization escaped in a rush of impossible sense. Inside the vault, holographic displays flickered to life. The technology was unlike anything in the galactic databases. It responded to Mitchell's presence like a loyal pet greeting its master after a long absence. Text appeared in languages that shifted and changed as she watched. Ancient human scripts that evolved into recognizable words. Sanskrit became Latin, became English, became something beyond English that she understood perfectly, without knowing how. Professor Mendez joined Mitchell inside the vault carrying portable translation equipment. The devices were completely useless. The holographic displays were already communicating in perfect human language. More than that, they were adapting their presentation to each person who looked at them. Mitchell saw technical diagrams and star charts. Mendez saw historical documents and linguistic analysis. Roberts saw mathematical formulas that described technologies beyond current human understanding. The archive told a story that rewrote everything humans thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. Long before the Galactic Council existed, there had been another power. An empire that stretched across thousands of worlds and ruled the stars through military might, that bordered on supernatural. They called themselves Terrans, and they were human in every way that mattered. The ancient Terrans had not conquered through numbers or superior technology alone. They won wars by understanding their enemies better than the enemies understood themselves. Terran generals could predict fleet movements weeks in advance. Terran admirals could find weaknesses in defenses that had never been tested. Terran soldiers fought with a coordination that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Mitchell read battle reports that described impossible victories. A single Terran cruiser defeating entire alien battle groups. Invasion forces that captured planets without losing a single soldier. Defensive actions where tiny human fleets held off armadas that should have overwhelmed them in minutes. The victories were so one-sided that enemy civilizations simply surrendered rather than face Terran forces in battle. But the Terran Empire had not lasted forever. The archive contained records of a great catastrophe that scattered humanity across the galaxy. Solar flares that disrupted communication networks. Plague ships that carried diseases which destroyed memory as well as life. Refugee fleets that fled to primitive worlds where they forgot their true heritage. The Empire had fallen not to enemy action but to natural disaster and the slow erosion of knowledge. The survivors had become the humans of Earth. Primitive, tribes who retained only fragments of their ancestral knowledge. Cave paintings that showed star maps they no longer understood. Myths about gods who traveled between worlds. Legends of warriors who could defeat any enemy. The genetic potential remained, but the memory was lost. Until now, Professor Mendez discovered technical manuals that described weapons and ships far beyond anything in the current human fleet. The designs were elegant in their simplicity, but incorporated principles that modern scientists barely understood. Energy systems that drew power from space itself, armor that became stronger when damaged, weapons that could track targets across interstellar distances. More importantly, the archive contained training programs and battle doctrines that explained how ancient humans had been so effective in combat. It was not just technology that made them dangerous. It was an approach to warfare that treated battle as art and strategy as instinct. The manuals described techniques for reading enemy intentions and tactical patterns. That seemed almost magical. Roberts found psychological profiles that analyzed how different alien species thought and fought. The ancient Terrans had understood their enemies on a level that went beyond intelligence gathering. They could predict how individuals would react under stress. They knew which species would fight to the death and which would retreat when faced with overwhelming odds. They fought wars by understanding minds, not just weapons. Mitchell transmitted the archive data back to Earth using quantum communications that somehow bypassed the Council's monitoring systems. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Military analysts who studied the Terran battle plans found them strangely familiar. Tactics that felt natural even though they had never been taught. Strategies that seemed obvious once explained but had never occurred to human commanders. Dr. Lisa Chang reviewed the diplomatic records stored in the archive and discovered the truth behind humanity's banishment. The Galactic Council was not thousands of years old as they claimed. They were the survivors of species that had once served the Terran Empire, servants who had overthrown their masters when the Empire fell. They remembered what humans had been capable of, and they were terrified that humanity might remember too. The quarantine was not punishment for recent human aggression. It was a desperate attempt to keep humanity weak and divided. The Council had been manipulating human development for generations, steering them away from certain technologies, encouraging dependence on alien systems, making sure that humans never rediscovered their true potential. The banishment was just the final step in a plan that had been centuries in the making. President Nicole Davis called an emergency meeting of Earth's military leadership. Admiral Morrison joined the session from his flagship while Governor Parker linked in from Mars. The implications of the Tannhauser discovery were staggering. Humanity was not a young species stumbling into galactic politics. They were the rightful heirs to an empire that had once ruled the stars. Davis read from the archive files that described human genetic memory. The aggressive instincts that the Council found so disturbing were not flaws to be corrected. They were evolutionary advantages passed down from ancestors who had survived by being the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Every human carried the potential for tactical genius in their DNA. They just needed to remember how to access it. The meeting ended with a decision that would change the course of human history. Earth's military academies would begin teaching Terran battle doctrines immediately. Research teams would start reverse engineering the weapons designs found in the archive. Most importantly, human commanders would be trained to think like their ancestors, to see warfare not as a necessary evil, but as humanity's greatest art form. Mitchell remained on Tannhauser Gate to continue studying the archive. Each day brought new discoveries about humanity's forgotten past. Technical specifications for star destroyers that could crack planets, biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers, defensive systems that could make entire solar systems invisible to enemy sensors. The ancient Terrans had been more than just warriors. They had been gods of war incarnate. As she worked, Mitchell began to understand why the Council had been so desperate to keep this knowledge hidden. They had not banished humanity from the stars to protect galactic peace. They had done it to protect themselves, because somewhere deep in human genetic memory lay the power to reclaim an empire that had never truly fallen. It had only been sleeping, and now it was beginning to wake up. Admiral Grace Sullivan stood in the war room beneath Geneva and watched as Earth's military doctrine was reborn. The walls were covered with displays showing Terran battle plans that had been dormant for 50,000 years. Around the table sat generals and admirals who had spent their careers learning to fight like civilized beings. Now they were remembering how to fight like humans. The transformation had begun 3 weeks ago, when the first Terran training manuals were distributed to human military academies. Officers who read them reported strange experiences, battle strategies that felt familiar despite being completely alien to modern warfare, tactical insights that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. It was as if the knowledge had been sleeping in their minds, waiting for the right trigger. Colonel Danny Wright commanded the first unit to complete the new training program. His Marines had spent 2 weeks studying ancient Terran assault doctrines, and the results were remarkable. They moved with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Individual soldiers anticipated each other's actions without communication. Squad leaders made tactical decisions that proved perfect, despite being based on incomplete information. Wright himself could not explain what was happening to his unit. When he looked at a tactical situation, he found himself knowing things he had never learned. Where enemy forces would concentrate their fire, which defensive positions could be bypassed entirely, how to coordinate attacks across multiple fronts without advanced communication systems. The knowledge felt like inherited memory awakening after generations of sleep. The first test of the new doctrines came when Council Sentinel drones moved to intercept a human supply convoy near the quarantine boundary. Wright's unit was deployed to escort the convoy using tactics copied from Terran archive files. The engagement lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, 3 Sentinel drones had been captured intact, and the supply convoy continued on its mission without a single casualty. Captain Laura Kim commanded the stealth frigate Phoenix during humanity's first reconnaissance mission into Council space. Her ship had been retrofitted with technology reverse-engineered from Tannhauser archive data, cloaking systems that bent light around the hull, sensor dampeners that made the Phoenix invisible to all known detection methods, engine modifications that left no heat signature or gravitational disturbance. Kim's mission was to observe Council fleet movements and gather intelligence on their intentions toward humanity. What she discovered was worse than anyone had feared. Massive armadas were gathering at strategic points throughout Council space. Planet-killer weapons were being moved into position near human colonies. The Council was preparing for a final solution that would end the human threat permanently. The Phoenix penetrated deeper into Council space than any human ship had ever traveled. Kim found herself navigating by instincts she did not understand, avoiding patrol routes that were not marked on any chart, timing her movements to coincide with activities that should have been unpredictable. It was as if she could sense the rhythm of enemy operations through some sixth sense, inherited from her Terran ancestors. General Tony Russo faced the ultimate test of Terran doctrine when a Council enforcement fleet moved to bombard the colony world of New Geneva. His ground forces were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. The orbital bombardment platforms carried enough firepower to sterilize the planet's surface. By every rule of modern warfare, the battle was already lost before it began. But Russo did not fight by modern rules. Using strategies pulled from the Tannhauser archive, he turned New Geneva itself into a weapon. The planet's magnetic field became a massive electromagnetic pulse generator. Solar collectors were converted into orbital defense platforms. Even the weather control systems were weaponized to create storms that disrupted enemy communications and targeting systems. The Council fleet found itself fighting not just human soldiers, but the planet itself. Their ships were hit by lightning that followed them through space. Their communications were jammed by electromagnetic storms that appeared from nowhere. Their weapons missed targets that should have been impossible to miss. After 6 hours of impossible losses, the fleet retreated in confusion, leaving New Geneva unharmed. News of human victories spread through underground networks that connected oppressed species throughout the galaxy. The Karathi mining slaves heard whispers of humans who fought like gods. The Zentaran refugees remembered old stories about Terran protectors who had once defended the weak. Dozens of species that had been conquered or enslaved by Council member civilizations began reaching out to humanity through secret channels. Dr. Lisa Chang received the first alien communication on a frequency that should not have existed. The message was from a Karathi resistance cell offering intelligence about Council weapons facilities. They remembered legends of the Terran Empire passed down through 100 generations. Stories of humans who had once liberated their homeworld and taught them to fight for freedom. More messages followed from other species. Zentaran refugees provided star charts showing hidden Council bases. Freelance traders shared information about fleet movements and supply schedules. Even some Council member species sent secret communications offering to change sides when the war began. The galaxy was full of beings who had been waiting for the Terrans to return. Admiral Morrison studied the intelligence reports flowing in from across the galaxy and began to understand the true scope of what humanity was becoming. The quarantine had been intended to keep humans isolated and weak. Instead, it had given them time to remember their true nature without council interference. Every day, more human officers discovered tactical abilities they had never known they possessed. The captured Sentinel drones provided the final piece of the puzzle. When human technicians examined their computer systems, they found something unexpected. The drones were not just programmed to contain humanity. They were programmed to monitor for specific behavioral patterns, signs that humans were remembering their Terran heritage. The Council had been watching for this awakening, and now their worst fears were coming true. President Davis authorized the construction of the first new Terran warships in 50,000 years. The designs came from the Tannhauser archive, but the materials and manufacturing techniques were purely human. Ships that could phase between dimensions to avoid enemy fire. Weapons that could track targets through hyperspace. Armor that repaired itself using energy from incoming attacks. The shipyards of Luna and Titan worked around the clock to build the new fleet. Human workers found themselves understanding alien technologies that should have taken years to master. Assembly line teams coordinated their efforts with inhuman precision. Quality control inspectors spotted flaws in designs that had never been tested. The ships took shape faster than anyone had thought possible. Captain Wright received command of the first completed warship, the UES Vengeance. Standing on its bridge, he felt a connection to something larger than himself. The ship's systems responded to his thoughts as much as his commands. Navigation computers plotted courses he had only imagined. Weapons systems targeted enemies that existed only in tactical simulations. The boundary between human and machine seemed to dissolve. As more ships joined the growing fleet, human commanders began to operate as a collective consciousness. They shared tactical insights across impossible distances. Battle plans developed simultaneously in multiple locations. Strike forces coordinated their actions without any central command structure. It was as if humanity was becoming something more than the sum of its individual parts. Admiral Sullivan watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and concern. The humans under her command were becoming incredibly effective warriors, but they were also becoming something alien to her experience. They moved and thought and fought with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. She wondered if this was what the ancient Terrans had been like in their prime. The Council's response was swift and desperate. Emergency fleets were assembled to reinforce the quarantine boundary. Planet-killer weapons were moved into position around human colonies. Diplomatic channels buzzed with messages about the growing human threat. But it was already too late. The god of war had awakened, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. Fleet Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Terran Pride and watched the largest human armada in 50,000 years emerge from hyperspace. The Nexus system stretched before them, filled with the ancient fortress worlds of the Galactic Council. Massive orbital platforms bristled with weapons that could destroy planets. Council fleets numbered in the thousands hung in formation around their most sacred strongholds. The human fleet should have been impossibly outnumbered, 200 ships against 10,000. But these were not the same vessels that had once begged for Council acceptance. The new Terran warships moved like living things through space. Their hulls shifted and flowed as armor systems adapted to incoming threats. Their weapons fired from angles that violated geometry. Their engines left no trace for enemy sensors to follow. High Arbiter Veltar observed the approaching human fleet from the central command station of Nexus Prime. The being of pure thought had existed for over 10,000 years and commanded the Council during humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. It had voted for the quarantine, believing that isolation would eventually lead to human extinction. Now it watched its greatest fear become reality. The first phase of battle began when human ships simply vanished from Council sensors. One moment they were visible on long-range scans. The next moment they had disappeared completely. Council fleet commanders found themselves fighting ghosts that struck from impossible directions. Weapons fire came from empty space. Ships exploded without any sign of what had attacked them. Captain Laura Kim commanded a squadron of stealth frigates that materialized inside Council formations like demons from Nightmare. Her ships appeared between enemy vessels and unleashed devastating close-range attacks before vanishing again. Council ships found themselves firing on each other as they tried to hit targets that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Admiral Grace Sullivan coordinated the battle from her flagship, using tactical doctrines that treated three-dimensional space as merely a suggestion. Human ships moved through hyperspace in ways that should have been impossible. They attacked from the past and defended from the future. Enemy formations were torn apart by strategies that existed outside normal causality. General Tony Russo led ground assault teams that boarded council stations through teleportation systems, reverse-engineered from Terran archives. His soldiers appeared inside supposedly impregnable fortresses and disabled defense systems from within. They moved through enemy installations like they had built them themselves. Every corridor and junction was familiar territory to genetic memories that spanned millennia. The Council's greatest weapons proved useless against enemies who fought by rules that transcended physical law. Planet-killer beams passed harmlessly through human ships that existed in folded space. Gravitational weapons found no targets to lock onto. Quantum disruptors failed to affect vessels that operated outside normal quantum mechanics. High Arbiter Veltar sent desperate communications to Council fleets throughout the galaxy. Emergency reinforcements were ordered to converge on the Nexus system immediately. Ancient weapons that had been sealed away for thousands of years were activated and brought online. Every resource of galactic civilization was mobilized to stop the human advance. But the reinforcements never arrived. Admiral Morrison had deployed human task forces to intercept them using intelligence provided by alien resistance movements. Council fleets found themselves trapped in ambushes that seemed to predict their every move. Supply convoys were destroyed before they knew they were under attack. Communication networks were jammed by signals that appeared to come from everywhere at once. Dr. Lisa Chang broadcast a message to the entire galaxy from the bridge of the Terran Pride. Her words were transmitted on frequencies that reached every inhabited world and every spacefaring vessel. She spoke of humanity's true heritage and their return to galactic affairs. The age of Council dominance was ending. The time of Terran protection was beginning again. Chang's message was heard by billions of oppressed beings throughout Council space. On mining worlds, Karathi slaves rose up against their overseers. In refugee camps, Zentaran families prepared to return to their stolen homelands. Throughout the galaxy, species that had been conquered or enslaved saw hope for the first time in generations. The Terrans had returned to fulfill their ancient promise of protection. The battle for Nexus Prime reached its climax when human boarding parties penetrated the central command station. General Russo personally led the assault on the High Arbiter's chambers. Ancient Terran warriors had once walked these same corridors when the station was first built. Now their descendants returned to reclaim what had always belonged to humanity. High Arbiter Veltar faced the human general in the chamber where humanity had first been sentenced to exile. The being of pure thought tried to communicate with Russo, using telepathic abilities that had once seemed godlike to primitive species. But human minds had evolved beyond such manipulation. Russo saw the Arbiter not as a superior being, but as a frightened child hiding behind stolen authority. The surrender came not through violence, but through recognition of inevitable defeat. Council forces throughout the Nexus system laid down their arms as human tactical superiority became undeniable. Enemy commanders who had fought for centuries against impossible odds finally acknowledged that they faced opponents who operated on a level beyond their comprehension. Admiral Sullivan announced the terms of peace from the captured council chambers. There would be no revenge against species that had supported the quarantine, no punishment for governments that had voted to exile humanity. But the age of council rule was over. Oppressed peoples would be freed. Corrupt governments would be removed. Justice would be enforced by those strong enough to protect the innocent. President Nicole Davis addressed the galaxy from the newly constructed orbital palace above Earth. Humanity had not sought to return to war, but they had been forced to remember their true nature. The species that had once been cast out as too dangerous for civilization had returned not as conquerors, but as guardians. The Terran Empire was reborn, but it would be built on protection rather than domination. In the months that followed, human fleets spread throughout the galaxy, liberating worlds and establishing new governments based on justice rather than fear. The Karathi returned to their ancestral mining worlds as free people. The Zentarans reclaimed homelands that had been stolen generations ago. Dozens of species discovered independence they had never thought possible. The former Council species were offered a choice. They could join the new Terran Protectorate as equal members, or they could maintain their independence under human protection. Most chose integration, recognizing that cooperation offered benefits that domination never could. A few chose isolation, and were granted it with the understanding that they would never again threaten galactic peace. Admiral Morrison established the new Terran Naval Academy on Luna, where young humans learned to balance the warrior heritage in their genes with the wisdom needed to protect, rather than conquer. Students studied ancient battle doctrines alongside courses in diplomacy and cultural understanding. They learned that strength without wisdom was tyranny, but wisdom without strength was helplessness. Dr. Sarah Mitchell continued her research on Tannhauser Gate, where new discoveries revealed the full scope of humanity's forgotten legacy. The Terran Empire had lasted for over 20,000 years before its fall. During that time, it had protected countless species and established peace across vast regions of the galaxy. The genetic memory that had awakened in modern humans carried not just military knowledge but the wisdom of ages. Children throughout human space learned about their heritage in schools, where ancient Terran battle standards hung alongside symbols of hope and renewal. They were taught that their ancestors had been the galaxy's protectors, and that they carried the same responsibility. Every human child grew up knowing that they were born to defend those who could not defend themselves. The god of war had awakened, but it was not the mindless destroyer that the Council had feared. It was something far more dangerous to tyrants and far more precious to the innocent. It was justice armed with irresistible force. It was protection backed by unlimited power. It was humanity remembering not just how to fight, but why they fought. Fleet Admiral Morrison stood on the observation deck of Terran Command and looked out at the stars that humanity had reclaimed. The quarantine barriers that had once caged his people were gone. In their place stretched trade routes and communication networks that connected thousands of worlds in peace and prosperity. The galaxy was vast, and there were still tyrants to defeat and innocents to protect. But humanity was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The Terran Empire had returned, and this time it would never fall.